the show. This show is all about you. Not you, but you and your stories. Because everybody has a story with Jeff Seltzer. Everybody has a story with Jeff Seltzer. Brought to you by JeffSeltzer.com.
Hello and welcome to Everybody Has a Story with Jeff Seltzer. I am your host, Jeff Seltzer, and once again, this is my own personal midlife crisis. We've made it to episode 69, dude. Shout out to Bill and Ted. In any event, I'm really excited that we've gone 69 episodes at this point. So at almost 2 years in, this has definitely been quite a journey for me, both from a learning perspective, experiential perspective, meeting people, and just helping to share people's stories. A few things I wanted to bring up before I bring in my guest for this week. So first of all, in what's been an amazing just journey over the last few weeks, Joanna Rodriguez, her episode from a few weeks ago, I believe it was episode 67, in only like 3 weeks is already the number 2 episode of all time, which is insane. I have episodes that have been up for a year and a half, for almost 2 years at this point, and it is literally the second most streamed episode of all time. So I do believe that it will probably overtake the number 1 episode, which is coincidentally episode 1 with Dana, talking about celebrity autographs and conventions. So great episode. Love to see it. Joanna's amazing. She's doing really well. So very excited that we're able to share her story. And, so many people were able to relate to it. I got a lot of great comments about it as well. Wanted to talk about one of my favorite wrestlers that's out there these days, a guy named Danhausen. So oftentimes people like to talk about like their favorite bands and how they were like an OG fan for that band. Right. So like bands that, were around, in small clubs or doing little things, and someone's a fan of it and all of a sudden they make it big. And then all of a sudden everyone likes them, but people would say, hey, I liked them before they were huge. Danhausen, I don't want to say that I'm like a true OG Danhausen fan, but I've been a huge fan of Danhausen for at least, let's say 4 or so years at this point. Rob, my older daughter, mentioned like, oh, you're like an OG Danhausen fan. I say that because when he first went to AEW, even right before that, about 4.5 years ago or so, like he just clicked with me. I think as a personality, he's great. As a wrestler, he's fun, and all that kind of stuff. I met him at a number of wrestling conventions and just the nicest guy in the world. Like I've talked in the past about how John Cena has been like my favorite wrestler that I've ever met. Hung out with him at a commercial shoot via when I worked at Post Serial. But Danhausen, I would say, is up there with John Cena. And the fact that every time I've met him, he's been super nice, very conversational, very open, and just like loves to talk, and just a really, really cool, down to earth guy. So again, number of years, I saw him wrestle in GCW, saw him wrestle in AEW, and then a few months ago, he signed with and debuted in WWE. Now, I mention this because for most of the wrestling audience, the first time they ever saw or heard of Danhausen was in February of 2026 when he debuted at a WWE event. I know this because A, that's what I've seen online, but also B, when I was at WrestleMania last month, there was somebody who was sitting near me and I was talking to him and I had a Danhausen t-shirt on, and he was just blown away the fact that like myself and my buddy Daniel have been fans of Danhausen for years and met him for over a number of years. He was like, yeah, I'd never heard of him before the end of February. So a lot of people tend to forget that there are WWE fans, there are AEW fans, there are wrestling fans, that just because somebody exists outside of your bubble doesn't necessarily mean that they exist. So love that Danhausen is doing fantastic things in WWE. He's truly one of my favorite things and favorite wrestlers and entertaining acts that I watch these days. So again, shout out to Danhausen. Absolutely love the guy. Really, really fun to watch him. Before we go any further, I wanted to bring up the plugs for the show, the usual stuff. So as always, you can find the show's Instagram at Everybody Has a Story Pod. The show's YouTube is at Everybody Has a Story Pod. You can email the show directly at everybodyhasastorypod@gmail.com. For all things Jeff Seltzer, you can always check me out at jeffseltzer.com. Reminder, we're on all podcast platforms. We are video on Spotify and YouTube. We are audio on Spotify and YouTube, as well as Apple, Amazon, iHeartRadio, Pandora. Pretty much anywhere you can find a podcast, you could probably find this. One last thing I want to talk about before I bring in my guest for the week. So I know over the last couple of years, I've talked about the multiple Jeff Seltzers. So there was a Jeff Seltzer, the track star in high school, who went to a different town than me, same age as me, and I was always confused for. That was that one. Then there was the Jeff Seltzer from about a year ago that I reached out to try to get on my podcast. I think he's a hedge fund manager. And then looking via AI, he is the most, what did I say? I did a quick search on Google for the most well known, I guess, Jeff Seltzer, something like that. And the hedge fund one was number one. I was number two, which kind of blew me away. There's like 60 or so living Jeff Seltzers in this country, I believe. I was number two, which was pretty exciting. Another Jeff Seltzer that I found recently by accident was because somebody messaged me on Facebook and was like, "Hey, did you just run the London Marathon? Because I talked to a guy named Jeff Seltzer on the train coming home." And I was like, "No, it wasn't me." I thought this person was messing with me. Then I did a quick search of the London Marathon results and found another Jeff Seltzer who actually ran it. He ran it like 6 hours and 35 minutes, which, again, running any kind of marathon, I think is pretty insane. I ran a marathon back in 2002. I was 24 years old, did it in like 5 hours, 35 minutes, walked the last 7 miles, basically limped it. So anybody who trains for and does a marathon, I think is insane, but, obviously I fully respect it. But here's another Jeff Seltzer that did run a marathon, this one in London. So if there's a Jeff Seltzer out there listening, congratulations, great job with the marathon. With that said, I did want to introduce my guest for this week. So my guest this week is a friend of mine. Met him probably about 6 months ago or so. So I'd like to welcome Roger Lee to the podcast. Roger, how are you today?
I'm well, Jeff. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for asking. So for those that don't know, this is Roger Lee. I want to give him an opportunity to kind of give through a little bit of his background in terms of who he is, what he likes to do, and maybe why he's here today.
Hey, yeah, thanks, Jeff. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for having me. I understand we're going to talk a little bit about the airline industry, which is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I try to talk to my parents or my friends about these things, and they just sort of kind of tune out. So thanks for the opportunity. But I think if I had to give a 15-second intro, I think most people would probably describe me as a lifelong ape geek. I love planes, I love airlines and the companies that fly the planes. So since I was a kid, I always wanted to work in the airline business. And after I graduated from college, I spent a few years working at Delta, which I think were some of the most formative, most memorable, and certainly the most fun years of my life. And now we work together in some flavor. So, a little bit different from the airline industry, but it's a sector that I just can't stop thinking about.
Awesome. So first of all, Roger, thank you for joining the show, and definitely really excited to dig into your airline experience. So for those of you that don't remember, one of the early episodes I had Amit Mishra on, as he was a airline pilot. So friend of a friend who was he flies smaller jets, smaller airplanes, whatever else like that, and that just kind of intrigued me. Like, how does that happen? How does someone get into it? Obviously, transition to now, I'm talking to Roger, who didn't necessarily fly airplanes, but works, or used to work behind the scenes in the industry. So first thing I'll say, or remind all my listeners, is for me, working, I guess, on or with the airline industry would probably be one of the worst jobs I could ever do. As most people who listen to this podcast know, I have awful motion sickness. And at one point, I think I was getting sick, as in like vomiting, on probably about 10% of my flights. So for me, like if I was truly to go to hell, if that was really a thing, it would probably be to be like an airline attendant or somebody who works on a plane and has to like take off and land all day. Because for me, that just feels absolutely awful. But with that said, I'm an anomaly and I get that. So I know Roger, working in the industry, did not work on airplanes all the time. He worked more probably in the office, behind the scenes, stuff like that. So before getting too deep into it, can you kind of walk us through, I guess, first of all, you had said you've always wanted to work, in the industry. Like, how did you get into Delta? Like, was it something you just filled an application, you were there? Did you have a connection? Like, how did that first begin?
That's a funny story. But, first of all, I'd say I don't think you're an anomaly in the sense of, maybe not wanting to work in the industry, just given the whole, experience of travel today. Like, I get it. It's stressful. Like, airports are stressful places. They're busy. They're kind of chaotic. You're often there under like time, constraints, and, flying can be a little uncomfortable too. So, I get it. I get it. But, for me, like it all started, when I had a conversation with a friend of mine in college, and, he came to my room. He wanted to drop off some papers or something. And he noticed I had a model of a Delta Airlines plane, just like sitting on the desk. And he asked, "Oh, why do you have that plane?" I sort of told him, "Well, Like I grew up flying Delta, like I'm from the South. So that's like one of the big airlines that's well represented near Atlanta. It's an iconic brand that people love and it's, special. And he said, well, you know what? Like one of my best friends who lives in Alabama, his college roommate, also is working at Delta. He's doing a summer internship there. Maybe y'all should talk. And so I called this person and we just had a great conversation. I think we talked for about a couple hours, even though we had never met each other, just kind of like sharing fun facts about different kinds of airplanes, like why the Boeing 767-400, is like not as good as like the 757-200. And eventually he just put me in touch with the co-op program at Delta Airlines in their network planning group. And at the time, they only took folks who would do a co-op, so full semester co-op, as opposed to the summer internship. And so I actually made a decision there and then, like once I applied, that I would take a year off of college to go work at Delta.
Nice.
And so that's how I got my start. And then, got a return offer and then spent a few years after college working there, mostly in pricing, but also in the loyalty program there at Delta as well.
Awesome. So let me ask you a question then. How did your family take that? So at that point, it sounds like one of your goals, really fun goals, was to work in the airline industry. But to your point, you had to take a semester off of school. So without asking too many questions about who was financing or funding your college, were your parents fully supportive? Were they kind of questioning it? Kind of like, what was your family's mentality?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it took them by surprise a little bit for sure. I think it certainly took the advisors at college by surprise too, because normally people don't take a semester off to just go work at an airline, right? Like they take a semester off to go study abroad, maybe to work on a presidential campaign or for a nonprofit, but this was a little different. But I would say I think my parents were quite supportive.
Awesome.
Ever since I was young, I always had this dream of wanting to work at an airline. From a young, my earliest, like, I remember when we had these like career days in elementary school or middle school, and you like would dress up as like the occupation you one day wanted to have.
Right.
I remember like dressing up, various years alternating as a flight attendant, as a pilot, right? So I think this was always a dream of mine, and I'm grateful that they supported me in this. Now, I will say, one of the benefits of working for an airline is you get non-revenue standby travel privileges. And so once I told them that, hey, mom and dad, if you wanted, you could go to Paris for a weekend for free, maybe in business class. That sort of tipped them over to being from, passively supportive to, I would say, cheerleaders for the move down to Atlanta.
Got it. And for the civilians out there, non-rev just basically means that you can fly standby for free, right?
Right, exactly. So these are the folks. So typically, U.S. airlines have a really generous employee travel program. So typically, it's non-revenue travel. It's space available. So if there is a seat on the airplane, what happens is typically an employee can occupy that seat. So if you're on a flight and the doors are about to close, right? They've kind of closed the overhead compartments, but you see a rush of maybe 5, 6 people like clamoring onto the plane at the last minute, taking up what you thought was going to be an empty middle seat next to you.
Yep.
Those are typically more likely than not airline employees who are flying standby. So that's how it works in principle. It kind of differs by airline, but for U.S. airlines, it's generally pretty consistent. Yeah.
Nice. And our connections, our conversations over the last few weeks, I've seen that despite the fact that you left the airline industry years ago, you still are able to take advantage of that, right?
Yeah. So I always say, you want 3 kinds of friends in life. You want a doctor friend, you want a lawyer friend, and then I think you need an airline friend.
Of course.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Because typically it extends to friends, families, right? So different airlines, different policies, but typically your family comes for free and you get a few friends who can share the non-revenue standby travel.
Nice. And from my experiences, obviously, I've seen that like flight attendants have like different seats on there, right? So they generally are in like the alley or by the bathroom, whatever else like that.
Yeah, they have the jump seats. Yeah.
Yes. Are those seats eligible for your standby deal, or has to be like legit like consumer type seats?
It's a great question. So that policy differs by airline. So I would say typically for U.S. airlines, you need to be a certified crew member to occupy a flight attendant jump seat. If you want to sit on the flight deck, so typically on the flight deck, there's a seat also that folds down from the door to the flight deck, or on the larger wide body aircraft, there's typically like just another seat. For those seats, you have to be a pilot or an air traffic controller to occupy. But different airlines, especially those overseas, they are known to see non-revenue passengers in the flight attendant jump seats. So if you got stuck somewhere, say, and this was one of the great things about the industry, is there was a lot of reciprocity for these travel privileges. So not only could we fly non-revenue on Delta, but we also had reciprocity agreements with Lufthansa and some other airlines as well. And those airlines typically would be more, I think, permissive in letting airline employees writ large occupy flight attendant jump seats, at least in the cabin. So always a good option to get home. If every flight on your main airline is home, you just sit on the jump seat for a bit. Maybe they draft you into helping with the meal service, but always a good option.
Nice. And for clarification, what is the flight deck?
The flight deck is the cockpit. Yes, that's where the pilots are.
Which I'm going to assume that you probably are not certified for or licensed for, correct?
Yes, no, I am not certified to fly an airplane. No,
okay. Not yet. Maybe one day, right?
No, one day.
Cool. So that's an awesome perk. I mean, I guess the only downside to it is, in a busy weekend, in theory, you can fly to a random place, but then possibly get stuck there if every flight coming back is like on a holiday weekend, right? So next weekend is Memorial Day, right? So in theory, you could probably on a Thursday maybe fly, I don't know, Boise, Idaho, or something like that, right? Just make up a place.
Yeah.
But then if your idea is I want to fly home like Memorial Day Monday, which is a holiday, that's probably one of the busier travel days. So it's probably tougher, and you're kind of taking a gamble that you get home that day. Would that be correct?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a little bit of an art and science and kind of, understanding what the likelihood of your being able to get a seat on a given flight is.
Right.
So we have access to, typically most airlines, they have an employee portal where you can look up the bookings, the load factors for the flights. And so, for example, like I can check like, okay, tomorrow's flight to say Chicago or to San Francisco, how many seats are available on that aircraft and how many have been sold. So that's a good way to get a sense of, okay, what's my likelihood of, making the flight? And typically you can also see the list of employees, other airline employees who have put in essentially a listing, a reservation for that flight. So for a US airline, this typically works by seniority. American does it differently. It's by time of check-in. But for most US airlines, it's when you were hired. That determines the order in which you are cleared onto the aircraft, assuming there are available seats. So there are a lot of different factors that go into it. So certainly the usual travel patterns, right? Like Friday afternoons, always going to be a little tough.
Sure.
Versus like a Tuesday, a Saturday, that kind of thing. But there are so many unpredictable things that are kind of hard to sort of plan for. And, one of my favorite non-rev stories at Delta was the time I got stuck in Santiago, Chile for 3 days. Yes. And so here's the thing. So here's something I had to learn the hard way. So airlines, US airlines, they actually carry a lot of cargo in the belly of the aircraft. So, US airlines, they fly passenger planes, but it turns out that underneath the aircraft, underneath the cabin, you can actually take a lot of cargo. So not just your bags, but you can load pallets of everything from, pharmaceuticals to, cars. Like I've seen entire cars shipped on Delta flights from Atlanta to Stuttgart and vice versa. And it turns out in Chile, one of their principal exports is farmed salmon. And so farmed salmon, it's one of the top things that gets, shipped out of Chile. And because it's perishable, it has to be flown on aircraft.
Okay.
And it's also very heavy because you have to pack it with ice, right? So it's also quite dense, quite hard to move, right? And so what would happen on all of our Chile flights is that even if you had 100 open seats, they would prioritize the loading of essentially frozen salmon onto the aircraft, right? Because that was revenue generating for the airline, right?
Sure,
so
makes sense.
every pound of salmon they took, right, created dollars for Delta.
Of course.
Whereas I would not create dollars for Delta. I was just occupying an empty seat.
Well, unless you're going to buy the snack on the flight or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That kind of thing. And so, there was just a period when I was in Chile where I was stuck for 3 days because those 3 days had just tons of salmon.
It was salmon season, huh? Is that it?
Salmon season, right? And it's just and so you just kind of make the most of it. But it's actually quite common. Like the more I travel, the more I realized there are a lot of these interesting quirks in the network. that throw in an additional layer of like complexity when you're trying to plan this travel. Yeah.
Did you find anything fun to do in Chile? So I'll give us an example. So years
Yeah.
ago, when I worked for Post Serial, I flew out to Minneapolis, Minnesota. I think around like noon one day, I found out that my flight for that day was canceled. The next flight I could take was like 6 a.m. the next day. So I immediately checked out of my hotel, got a hotel near the Mall of America, and legit just spent like half the day at the Mall of America. Um,
Yeah.
I think I went to a bar. I drank quite a bit. I went bowling. That mall is huge. It's in amusement park. It's ridiculous. I mean, American Dream Mall is open here since New Jersey, but like legitimately, like it is ridiculous how big the mall is. Like everything. I was at the aquarium. I was like, you know what? How often do you get to Minneapolis? Let's just do it. I had a lot of fun with it. So I guess back to my original question. So you're stuck in Chile for 3 days. Did you find stuff that you normally wouldn't have? Did you do extra stuff? Did you sit in the hotel just kind of working? Like what did that look like?
Well, this was pre-COVID, so the concept of working remotely wasn't quite as robust, so I ended up just taking those days off,
Gotcha.
just emailing my manager and saying, "Hey, sorry, I got stuck."
I'm stuck in Chile, right?
Um, but the great thing about
a very believable story, I'm sure. Yeah, I'm stuck on the moon. I can't work for the next week. I'm sorry, guy.
well, the thing with like being in the airline industry is that there's actually quite a bit of understanding when these things happen because everyone participates, right? Like everyone has their own version of a story of where they got stuck, and so it's the kind of thing where I think as long as you're responsible and you're not stuck every weekend in Munich, because you try to get on a flight that was clearly oversold, right?
Like every weekend going to Tokyo from like New Jersey or something like that. It's like, guys, it's a 15-hour flight. Like, there's no way you can sustainably do this every weekend.
Exactly. But I think to kind of your question, I did find interesting things to do, and I think it's sort of maybe indicative of I think how airline employees approach travel. The cost of going somewhere is just I think very low, right? Like it changes your perception of distance.
Right.
And so when you go places, you do kind of, seek out things that maybe, folks who are paying for a ticket or on maybe a very tight travel schedule would normally overlook because they're there for maybe like in Rome, once in their lifetime and they're only there for a week. So they have to do all the top tourist sites. But I think when you work for an airline, like you can, to use your example, you can go to Tokyo like every other month, right? It's not, it's not that outrageous to consider. And so what happens is you end up kind of just walking around. I think you end up slowing down. You kind of, end up just sort of following where your nose leads you in a lot of cases. And so because you know in the back of your head that you can always go back.
Of course.
But what I did in Chile, it was awesome. I just, I went to a vineyard, just took a bus out to one of the vineyards out there, just kind of explored that area a little bit. The next day, I took a day trip to Valparaiso, which is this coastal port city that's built on all these hills. They have color, it's like very colorful. Kind of has a salty like sailor's vibe to it. And I think the third day, I actually spent time in Santiago proper.
Nice.
I went to their museum of I think the Museum of Human Rights, which is really really powerful for a lot of reasons. They were a dictatorship, I think, back in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And so it was a really powerful, I think, reminder of like how far, they've gone from that period to where they are today, where a lot of folks consider them like one of the success stories in modern Latin America. So yeah, I made use of my 3 days. I didn't do a whole lot of work, but did a bit of travel. And so the great thing too is there were other employees too from Delta who were with me. And so we just kind of like formed a little travel group. We're like, why not? We'll just go to Valparaiso and then let's go back to the airport and try again and see if there are seats for us on this flight.
So you didn't research the salmon aspect that caused you a 3-day delay there? That wasn't
not really. Like there were these sort of, I think at the time, Delta, the employee travel portal, they had these like vague sort of alerts on certain flights that would say, sometimes this flight is payload optimized.
Sure.
Which is like a great euphemism for essentially weight restriction.
It's not going to happen, right?
Yeah. It's like, okay, like sometimes that mean, this flight, next flight, like it's hard to predict.
Right.
So I sort of had a sense that maybe this was an issue, but it's all anecdotal. Like there's no database that says, yeah, like 80% of flights from Chile to Atlanta are going to be payload optimized where they, have to like prioritize cargo over like employee standby travel. Yeah.
Gotcha. So, I mean, great story. Awesome. And obviously very curious in terms of like, the aspect of, flying working for an airline and then flying for free, and your situation now, obviously still reaping the benefits years later. Getting back to actually the airline industry though. So you said you worked in the loyalty group, or like what did you actually do when you worked for Delta?
Yeah, so I got my start in the network planning division. So this is the division of the airline that essentially decides, where Delta or where an airline should fly, and then what airplanes should be used to fly those routes, and then finally, like what the schedule should look like. So it's a very like top-down approach. They look at, essentially the number of people that are flying between certain city pairs, and they, consider factors like, what the fares are like, what the competition, on that route is, what the profile of the market is. Is it more leisure oriented? Is it a little bit more, business travel oriented? And they use those factors to determine should Delta or some airline fly that route? Should it be done on a nonstop basis? Should it be flown with this kind of aircraft, that kind of aircraft, and what the schedule should look like? And so to use an example, like to use this Chile example, network planning, this group would decide, okay, like, there are 500 people who fly every day from, points on the east coast of the U.S. to Santiago, Chile. We at Delta think we can capture maybe 60% of that because of, the position of our hub, right, Atlanta, relative to maybe American or United or LATAM. And this is typically the average fare. So we think it supports a nonstop service. But there are only, maybe 200 people we think who would choose Delta versus American, given the schedule, connecting in Miami versus Atlanta versus nonstop from New York. And so we're going to assign the 767-300 to it because it has like the right seat count for that market. It also has the right operating cost for a route that's maybe probably a little less premium, a little more like oriented towards leisure, family, visiting family, friends, and relatives. And then we're going to make a decision on when we should fly that route. We think it should be a red eye because that optimizes connections. So that's how network planning works. It's a super cool part of the airline. I think it's, if you had to pick a job in airline, I would probably highly recommend working in network planning.
Got it. And how many years ago was this? How long ago did you work?
Oh, this was like 10 years ago.
So let me ask you this then. So obviously you went through a lot of stuff in terms of like planning and stuff like that. Like how much of that is like in 2026, how much would be automated? How much of it is just kind of copy and paste year over year, day over day to kind of do the flight that was done a week ago, whatever else like that? Like I would assume some of that's kind of changed in the last decade, or maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. I think with a legacy airline like American, Delta, and United, I think there is a big element of just optimizing the existing network. The domestic market, for example, is pretty mature. And so you kind of already know like what the capacity should look like year over year. Like, what the fares are, the profiles of the people who fly those routes. You kind of know the competition well.
Right.
I would say like the areas of opportunity that require a little bit more analysis, where it becomes, just as much of an art as it is a science, has been international, especially for the past 2 or 3 years, where that's been really one of the key growth drivers for the legacy airlines. Like there, you just don't really have a lot of data oftentimes. In the domestic market, the U.S. government, the U.S. DOT collects a lot of really good statistics. I think it's 10 to 35% of all tickets sold in the U.S. are sampled by the government. Okay. And that's then collected into a database that all airlines can, or the general public can use, and to inform network planning decisions. And so I think if you're making a data-based decision for the domestic market, it's somewhat straightforward, right? Of course, there's a lot of modeling. It's, I think, on the international front where you're making predictions on where you think people want to go, where the data doesn't necessarily show up, or it shows up in sources that are kind of hard to reconcile. Gotcha. That there's a lot of creativity.
Do other countries share that kind of data as well, or is it generally just the U.S. that?
Yeah, just the U.S. The U.S. The U.S. has really good data. I think it's somewhat unique in the world.
Gotcha.
There's like third-party data. There's this company, I think there's this company that releases data for international bookings. It's called MIDT. But again, it's like a subset of international bookings, and it's bookings that were made through third-party channels. And that's becoming increasingly more challenging to use because, more and more bookings are being made directly with airlines themselves through like Delta.com or United.com, so on and so forth in the US.
Gotcha.
But Yeah, but yeah, I would say that the international piece is fascinating, and you really do have to draw upon like novel data sources, or just like kind of your general sense of where you think the demand will be. So that's fun. Yeah.
Gotcha. So as mentioned earlier, like I'm not a great flyer, so I try to make the experience as comfortable as possible. So one of the things that I've done for myself is I have the United Chase Club card. So with that, I'm able to get access to all the United clubs and basically all of the, I guess, the U.S. airports. Um, Delta has their Sky Lounge. I think every domestic large scale airline has their own kind of lounge of sorts. Are those generally run by third parties, or like does Delta or United legitimately like run, own, and operate those lounges?
So the airline branded lounges are run by the airlines themselves. So
Gotcha.
like your United clubs, your Delta Sky clubs, the American, they call it the Admirals Club. So those are generally operated by the airline themselves. That said, a lot of the a lot of the work of the facilities themselves is often subcontracted. And so the folks who work in the Sky Club, even though it's run by Delta, might actually not work for Delta. They might work for a Sodexo type company, right?
Gotcha. So like the bartender, for example, may not necessarily be a Delta employee.
Exactly.
They
They're
could be
not.
a third
They're
party
most likely
contractor.
not Delta employees. The folks in the clubs who are typically airline employees are the ones who, they're typically a subset of the customer service agents
Right at the
who
desk, or
work
oftentimes,
exactly,
right, you'll have the opportunity, like if it's a change of flights or whatever else like that, it's somebody
exactly.
at the desk who either checks you in or kind of look at your flights.
Exactly.
Got it.
And oftentimes in my experience, they're often, some of the best agents like across the entire airline. Like they're often the most knowledgeable, like they tend to be a little bit more senior. So they're great. They're a great resource if you ever need to find a human to help you at an airport.
With your perks, do you get access to the Delta lounges, or is that not extended to you?
No, that's not extended to you. I think if you buy a ticket as a customer and you have a membership separately, then yes, you can access the club, but it's generally not extended to employees by default. Yeah.
Got it. Got it. Okay. So additional roles or jobs. I think you'd mentioned that you worked in loyalty as well. Is that correct?
Yeah, briefly in loyalty, I spent most of my time in the pricing organization.
Okay.
So at airlines, they call it the revenue management function, and it's one of the core bread and butter pieces of any airline. Yeah.
Sure. Sure. And I assume, obviously, in times like now, where for various reasons we're not getting into, like fuel costs go up and stuff like that, that's
Yeah.
probably where like people in your role are really making their money, because you can't keep fares flat if all of a sudden fuel costs go up significantly. So like, I
That's
assume,
right.
do you guys have like algorithms or models or whatever that you guys would get into in terms of figuring it, or like is it just dynamic, just automated for the most part, like in the app and such? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so surprisingly, airline pricing is quite manual. I think there is an element, without getting too into kind of the technical details, but typically in the revenue management group at an airline, there's one group that focuses on the pricing. We call it pricing strategy. So these are the folks who, take a broad look at the market. So kind of, what I was alluding to earlier with the network planning, but they essentially segment the market. They look at who is flying, what is the market share, right? What are the dynamics of the market? How far in advance are people booking? How long are they staying? What are the channels, right? And then they think about what the fares, should be based on those factors. And so this is ultimately quite strategic because you have to understand, who is flying, where are they flying, but most importantly, why are they flying to build an effective fare structure.
Right.
And then the second component to revenue management at an airline is what we call inventory management. So this process tends to be a little bit more automated and algorithmic. And what inventory does, in a nutshell, is they take the the fare structure that the pricing strategy team puts together, and then they release certain fares to the market based on their prediction of how well a particular flight on a given day is booking.
Got it.
So this like fare structure that the pricing strategy team, puts out, say they're kind of, trying to segment folks who book close in versus, further out, right? One way they could do that is they charge a little bit more for people who are buying close in, because these are people who, for whatever reason, typically have higher willingness to pay. Whereas if you're booking further out, like your plans are probably a little bit more flexible, right? So the fares are typically a little bit lower. So the inventory team takes this set of fares and then they essentially like look at how the flights are actually booking for a given day, and then they can close and open certain fares based on the realized or their prediction of willingness to pay closer in. And that part I would say is a little bit more algorithmic. But the pricing strategy piece absolutely has to be done with a little bit more, I think I'd say of a strategic mindset versus just kind of looking at things like overbooking rates, right? Like things like that can be a little bit more automated.
Gotcha. So a few questions on that. So let's say, for example, and I'll use United because I'm most familiar with that. Let's say you and I are both United Airline like loyalists, right? So
Sure.
you and I both log into our United account and we both separately look to book a seat for the same flight. Will we get offered the same price, or will airlines adjust based on my personalization versus your personalization?
No, there's I think they would love to do that, charge everyone a different price. But
Yeah.
no, I think you see a lot of news articles about how you need to clear your cookies, right? Because they're
Yes.
searching, they're tracking what you're searching, and no, they're not doing that. I can assure you, they're not doing that.
Gotcha.
What they are doing though is if you are a member of the loyalty program,
Yes.
they will offer you oftentimes a discount for an award fare, for example.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So if you're searching flights, say like Chicago to Frankfurt, and there's like a award ticket for 50,000 miles for general members, but
Yep.
or it might be 40,000 miles for someone who is signed up to the United loyalty program, right? For example. And I think that just sort of speaks to how the industry is evolving too. It's just this really, big focus on the loyalty program that wasn't there, I would say, even like 7-8 years ago. Yeah.
Gotcha. And follow-up question, which I'm sure my listeners would love to hear about too. So for me, I am, as you probably know, by default, a planner. Like for me, I've got the next 50 years of my life planned out almost the day that I die. So as a family, and I know usually flights only go on sale like 11 months out. What is the sweet spot in terms of booking a ticket? Generally, I'll book it, 10, 9, 8 months out or something like that.
Sure.
Recently, we booked the last minute trip to Disney World for next month. So we booked it like a month out. Like if you were to look at it from pricing perspective, like what is generally, keeping everything constant, right? Keeping fuel constant over the course of the year, keeping demand relatively as expected, all sorts of stuff like that. Like what would be the best time or the from a consumer perspective to book a ticket and probably get the cheapest or the least expensive fare?
Well, Jeff, I always tell people, the best time to book a flight is it's always Tuesday at 2:06 a.m. in the morning, using your Internet Explorer browser.
Of course.
No, it's a really hard question to answer because it's so dependent on the market. So, like it depends on the kind of passenger who is flying that market. So something like Disney, a little bit leisure oriented, there's going to be, I would say, less aggressive segmentation around fares when it comes to how far in advance you're booking. Whereas markets that are a little bit more, business travel oriented, you tend to see like, more robust fare structures, like closer in, like within 14 days, there might even be another fare for 7 days out, 3 days out, 5 days out. So it really depends on the market. Depends on when you're traveling. Saturdays, tend to be a little bit less pricey just because Fridays are kind of when folks want to actually get home by for it to start their weekend. But generally, like booking further out, I would say is a good rule of thumb. If I remember correctly, when I was, doing pricing strategy, a lot of the, leisure-oriented markets had fares that were, I think priced that were a little bit cheaper, starting from 120 days out, and they would increase at 90 days out, right? So that's like a threshold that I always like try to keep in mind personally when I'm booking fares. But the game changes too when you're looking at depending on the cabin as well.
Sure.
I think oftentimes you find as well as like and this is mostly for award fares, but for premium cabins, oftentimes airlines will lower the fare. They'll open up the inventory closer in when they realize they can't sell some of the seats, right? So it's really hard to predict. It really is hard to predict.
Gotcha. And I mean, I'll say this, and again, this obviously isn't based on any science. It's just based on N=1 experience. So I've often talked about every September I fly down to Orlando, Florida for Halloween Horror Nights, checking out Disney World, Universal by myself. And for me, it's like clockwork. I always do it. So generally, when tickets go on sale in October for the following September, I'll book my flight. Generally, somewhere like 11, 10, 9 months out,
Mm.
I can get first class to Orlando for, let's say, 6 or 650. Versus, as it gets closer, it's almost the same cost for economy, which always
Mhm.
blows me away in terms of like how the delta works. Like I know
Mm.
when we booked our flights for Orlando for next month, the ticket cost per person for economy was more than my usual or what it would cost me for a first class flight if I book it 10
Oh,
months out. So you never know how it is. And again, there's all sorts of algorithms and stuff behind it, as you had said. Um, and that's just one person's user experience, but obviously there's so many other factors at play, I guess, to look into, as you had said.
yeah, and airlines, as much as they are very, data driven, right? Like there's still a lot, that they're experimenting and piloting with on a day-to-day basis. Like one of the things that makes airline pricing just, so fascinating in my mind is that the fares can change by the hour, right? Like for international markets at least, you can submit fares to this, clearing platform, if you will, every hour, right? And so that provides a lot of rich opportunities to test and learn different kinds of fares. And and I think too, like when you think about how the industry is evolving, there's this big focus on premium demand, and without getting too philosophical, but there's this talk about our the K-shaped economy and the implications for that. And I think the airlines, are sort of evolving with that market as well. They're trying to think about how do we, position our premium products, given this, broader shift in society. Like I'll tell you, like back when I was at Delta, working on the Trans-Pacific markets, the majority of our customers flying in Delta One to Asia were primarily business travelers, right? Like these were folks who were flying from the U.S. to Japan, and for the auto industry, right? They were going to China, right, for some of the manufacturing opportunities. And there's still some of that, but I would say that the business class traveler mix, especially on international flights, is tilted increasingly towards the leisure traveler, right? And so airlines have to think about, what does the fare structure look like for your premium leisure traveler now?
Right.
And there's also premium economy that's, quite standard in most markets now too, which wasn't the case when I was at Delta, and we had to kind of figure out how do we price premium economy, right? This is a new segment in the US. Is it someone who is, typically an economy traveler who's willing to trade up, or is it a business traveler whose company wants to save a little on their travel budget and then, maybe like try to minimize some of the costs with business travel there too. So it's this constant cycle of, testing and learning and evolving with the broader shifts in society.
Yeah. So to that point, and this is last follow up, and we'll start working towards wrapping it up. And with the wealth gap doing what it does, not getting too deep into it, do you ever see like or foresee something in the airline industry where they almost have like planes that are just first class or like just premium? Or do you think that's not really ever going to be a thing?
There are airlines that do fly, business class only flights.
Okay.
There aren't that many. I think the best example is it's this French airline. It's called La Compagnie. They fly Paris to Newark, and they also have Milan to Newark. They do this on a narrow body A321 with, I forgot the seat count, but we'll call it like maybe less than 100 seats, right?
Sure.
So that's kind of a niche that I think, might work well in the future. The other good examples I can think of would be these airlines that operate super ultra long haul flights, where the cabin is, predominantly, premium. So the best example of this one would be Singapore Airlines. They fly nonstop Newark to Singapore
Okay.
on A350, and this aircraft only has business class and premium economy. But I think even without going the whole, say, like changing your LOPA to be entirely, premium, we are seeing like a greater portion of wide body aircraft for U.S. airlines being configured with more premium seats. And you see this with United. It's really admirable what they're doing. They've taken the newest 787s that they've taken delivery of, I think have 64 business class seats,
Wow.
up from like 40 right before. And so if you look at like the seat map, the premium cabin essentially goes all the way from the tip of the nose of the aircraft all the way to just behind the wing, right?
Yeah.
So you might have like 10, 12, 13 rows of economy, which is quite incredible to think about, right?
Yeah. And group one, I guess, would be huge at that point. If you're group two, you're kind of
Yeah,
screwed trying to find any kind of overhead space, right?
yeah. The entire like airplane is global services at that point, right? Global services, Premier 1K, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's where the airlines are making the most money, and I don't know how long it's going to continue. Could be some broader shift in society that could reset this sort of strategy. But for now, like every airline, like over the past 2-3 years, if you listen to their earnings call, they all been screaming premium, 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 right?
Right.
And that's translated into more premium seats on more aircraft.
Definitely. So, Roger, this has been great. Really interesting to me, and I'm sure to my listeners as well. So, thank you for sharing your story and sharing your experiences. Anything else that you wanted to share or talk about before we call it a day?
No, I would just say, to go back to your original point, Jeff, traveling, flying is stressful. I get it. But, I always try to go to the airport with a bit of a sense of wonder. When you walk around, you see folks really from like all 5, 6, 7, whatever inhabited continents, like mixing together in like a space of 550 to 100, 200 feet at a concourse, right? You have planes going to Delhi, to Shanghai, to London, all in the same place. And I think there's something really cool about that because it makes you think, where are these people going? Like, why are they going where they're going? It makes you kind of realize that everyone has a story, Jeff.
That's right. That's a great way to put it. A couple of weeks ago, I had Joanna Rodriguez on the podcast, and she suggested that I try to end each episode by asking my guest a question or two. So I'm testing this out with you, Roger. You're kind of my guinea pig here. So
Sure.
Let's kind of work through with this. So, and I think it's on topic here. So first question I would have is, what is your favorite airport? So you've flown a lot. You've worked in the industry. It could be for any reason. Like it could be either you've used it the most. It could be they've got the coolest lounge. It could be just for whatever novel reason it's the greatest. Like, what would you consider your favorite airport that you've been to?
Yeah. I really like airports that have a good sense of place. I think there are a lot of airports you fly through and they're just kind of like indistinguishable from an airport in another city, in another country. So I think airports that make an effort to, I think, tie in their, infrastructure with the culture, with the community that they serve, are really special to me. So a couple of good examples, that come to top of mind, I would say the new Portland airport. Absolutely gorgeous. I think the design language really evokes Pacific Northwest. They made an intentional effort to bring in vendors that represent the Portland community.
Nice.
So like there's no Starbucks, but there's like an outpost of like a local Portland like coffee shop, right? And the boutiques are not your like, duty-free Americas, but it's like it's an outpost of a company that sells boots and backpacks that were made in Oregon, right? So airports like that, I tend to be a huge fan of.
Nice. Last question. Are you a music guy? Like, do you listen to a lot of music or playlists and such, or not really?
A little.
Are there a few songs that you're listening to, or top songs on a playlist you listen to a lot, or not really these days?
I'm a big country music person.
Okay. Who would be your country music person at this point, or who would be your song or songs that you open up your app and you're like, hey, these are the songs I want to hear right now. Like, what's top for you right now?
Yeah, I think what's his name? I think I think this song is Hometown. It's called Hometown Heroes.
Okay.
I think it's let me see who is there are a couple artists on here. I want to make sure I get it right. But it's a song about the folks that they it's special to me because they first of all mention the town in Tennessee that I grew up on.
Okay.
And it's and they talk about some of the folks that they grew up with and in high school and are now doing great things, right? So they talk about like the high school quarterback who's now like a doctor. They talk about like the hometown, prom queen who's now a teacher at the school. And like I think family and community are really important to me, and I think it's one of the things I love about the South. So it's one of the songs that I always kind of have on repeat.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you for sharing. I appreciate that. I've said in the past that I like most music except for country. So for me, no, it's okay. I'm always trying to expand my horizons and trying to learn from other people as well. And I love the story you gave in terms of, why that song and like why it's interesting to you. So I appreciate your sharing. So thank you, Roger.
Of course. Thanks, Jeff, for having me.
Of course. I guess I'll do the same thing too. I'll talk about what I'm listening to right now, and then we'll call it a day. So as I mentioned in the past, I create playlists all the time. Oftentimes I'll create it based on my mood. It's kind of therapy for me in terms of what I'm experiencing, I'm going for. I'll do like 35 or 40 playlists a year. So right now, my most recent playlist I've created, the top few songs that are on it, Good Luck Babe by Chappell Roan, Welcome to the Black Parade, the Steve Aoki 10th Anniversary Remix, My Chemical Romance, Teenage Dream, the live version from 5 Seconds of Summer. So not the Katy Perry one.
Katy Perry
song? So it's a live remake of it by 5 Seconds of Summer. It's a pretty sweet song, pretty solid. I did find on YouTube a mashup of Apple and Good Luck Babe, so Charlie XCX and Chapel Roan. It's a pretty good one. I clipped it and put it in my playlist, which is awesome. My Life Would Suck Without You by Kelly Clarkson. I think it's a fun song. And then I got a bunch of wrestling theme songs, so like Danhausen's, Kit Wilson, a bunch of others. And then I end it with the Muppet Show theme, which is always a classic to me. So I grew up on the Muppets, love it, and the song is catchy every time. So that's me. With that said, Roger, thank you again as always. I do appreciate your listening. I appreciate our conversation, our friendship, and you coming on the podcast. So thank you again for that. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having me. This was a blast. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. So with that said, for everybody out there listening, as a reminder, we are on Instagram at Everybody Has a Story Pod, YouTube at Everybody Has a Story Pod. To email the show directly, you can email the show at everybodyhasastorypod@gmail.com. For all things Jeff Seltzer, you can always check me out at jeffseltzer.com. We also have everybodyhasastorypod.com. I have a pretty cool clip up there of when I did live commentary at a wrestling show. Reminder, we are on video on Spotify and YouTube. We are on audio on Spotify, YouTube, as well as everywhere else. iHeartRadio, Amazon, Pandora. Anywhere you can find a podcast, you can find this. If there's a place that has podcasts that you can't find this, definitely shoot me a note and let's see what we can do. Last reminder also, if you want to be a guest, definitely on Instagram at Everybody Has a Story Pod, shoot me a DM and tell me you'd like to be a guest. Additionally, for those of you that are listening, please add me as a follow. So follow on Apple and or Spotify. And it's been a while since we've gotten any reviews. So if you could add a review on Spotify and or Apple, that would be really appreciated. With that said, I hope everyone has an amazing day, amazing week, and I will be back in a few weeks. Take care, guys. Bye.
Everybody has a story with Jeff Seltzer. 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 Everybody has a story with Jeff Seltzer.